Hi students, this is Mrs. Mignell, and I thought I would just try to do a very brief how-to on rhetorical analysis. And I picked a scene in Legally Blonde. You may do the movie, you just may not do this particular scene. You'll notice here I have the name of the YouTube clip. It's Legally Blonde Great Clip. And there is the YouTube link. I'm going to play some of the clip here to discuss with you. So in your rhetorical analysis, what you're trying to answer is how effective is the text on its intended audience? So in your downdraft, you are identifying the text that you're going to analyze, and you're going to consider who was the intended audience of that text. So for Legally Blonde here, I have taken the time to check out who was the author. Now, in a movie, the author is the director and the screenwriters. So the author, I looked it up on Wikipedia. I found out that the director was an Australian director called Robert Luketic, and he's famous for Monster-in-Law and Paranoia. So I haven't seen either one. And the script was done by two women authors, Karen McCullough-Lutz and Kristen Smith, and they have worked together on a number of films. Karen is Filipino and Kristen is American. They're both writers and screenwriters. They both wrote 10 Things I Hate About You, which I am familiar with. Ella Enchanted, She's the Man, The House Bunny, and The Ugly Truth. So the screenwriters have an awful lot of credits to their name. I am familiar with their movies. Another part of the rhetorical situation is text. So what we did, we just went over the author. So the text is Legally Blonde. And we're focused on the scene with Professor Stromwell when Elle Woods, played by Reese Witherspoon, goes into her first class. And just before she goes into the class, she dresses up and she thinks that she really looks the part of a college student at Harvard Law School. And on her way in, she meets her old boyfriend that dumped her and briefly talks to him about getting accepted into Harvard. And then she walks into this classroom. So let me play just the beginning few seconds of this particular clip.
A legal education means you will learn to speak in a new language. You will be taught to achieve insight into the world around you and to sharply question what you know.
So that was the first few seconds of the scene, and it's pretty typical college classroom setup. You will notice the professor introducing themselves on the first day, the students all having computers except for Elle Woods, who is sitting in the front row. She notices everybody's opening up their computer. So she decides to look in her purse and she pulls out her fluffy pen and her heart-shaped notebook, and she very happily decides that she too will take notes. Part of the rhetorical situation, rhetorical situation is to also consider the intended audience. So this particular movie came out in July of 2001. It has a PG-13 rating, so it is for teens through adults. It is considered a rom-com, romance comedy. We call it a chick flick. And during the 90s and early 2000s, evidently there was this girl power movement. So it's part of the girl power movement in movies. Another thing that we also consider in the rhetorical situation is the situation. And this is not the situation that's in the movie. So we wouldn't talk about the situation of Elle Woods having to prove her boyfriend wrong and getting into Harvard and succeeding. Actually, the situation was, when was the movie created? When was this text created? This text takes a little bit of research. In July 2001, I happen to remember that lawyers were in short supply. So the movie did come in to promote going to law school. I don't know if that was intentional, but it sure was. It made a lot of professors at San Joaquin College of Law happy because they are hoping to see more college students coming in to become a lawyer. It was also just before 9/11. Not that I think that that had any kind of impact, but the world that showed in this movie is a world before the Twin Towers came down. I do think it's something you should at least be aware of. I don't know how much it affects the evaluation of the text. So part of what you're doing as you are brainstorming this, your downdraft, is you are fine tuning what you're going to focus on in your text, whether it's a written text or a picture or a movie like this. In a movie, you don't analyze the entire movie. You select a scene and you analyze that scene. So I fine-tune my question to say, how effective is the Socratic method seen in Legally Blonde on its intended audience? Because directly after this scene, she sits on the bench with the actor Luke Wilson, who is a postgraduate working for Professor Callahan, and he does point out that Dr. Stromwell does ask questions according to the Socratic method. So I've nicknamed this part of the movie the Socratic method. So now that you have pretty much mapped out the rhetorical situation of your text, then now you come down to think about the rhetorical appeals, which is ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos does not mean ethics, it does mean credibility. Logos means logic, and pathos or passion is the emotion of the piece. So coming back to that first scene that we looked at together, I felt it was very logical in its presentation of a first class in a first year law school, especially at Harvard, where you have the professor introducing herself, the students starting to type on their computers because Harvard is a top 3 university. It's very expensive. It's catered to the wealthy. So everybody that goes there will have the technology needed. There's Elle Woods, unaware that she's expected to have already prepared for the class, takes out her cute pen and her heart her notepad, because I guess she's never taken notes before in a class. So there is a little, I think that's pretty logical presentation of what a college class would look at Harvard Law. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to return to the clip and take a look at where Dr. Stromwell decides to ask Elle Woods a question in the class and her answer.
Now, I assume all of you have read pages 1 through 48 and are now well versed in subject matter jurisdiction. Who can tell us about Gordon versus Steele? Let's call on someone from the hot zone. Elle Woods.
Oh, um, actually, I wasn't aware that we had an assignment.
I find it very credible that the professor would take a look at the person in the front row. And because Elwood stands out by not having a computer and that ridiculous pen and her heart pad, that the teacher would go ahead and pretty much attack her by asking the question about the reading. I have to hand it to Elle Wood's character that she answers truthfully, that she didn't know that she had an assignment. So I find the scene credible as well as logical, having been in some classes that do expect you to have previously read. In graduate school, you get the list before you start school, and you do have to have the readings done before you walk into class. So that was very logical. The scene was also somewhat emotional in that she was looking down and she really didn't want to be called upon. And it kind of gave that pause. You knew the teacher was going to call on her, and you were feeling, oh no, she hasn't read the material. And she's going to get in trouble. What's going to happen? So in that particular instance, I do believe all the rhetorical appeals have been used. So now I'd like to go over to the ending scene where Dr. Strongmill actually asks another student in the class about how she feels about Elwood's not having prepared, and then the answer to that. And then we'll talk about the results of that clip, and we'll return to try to answer our original question.
Vivian Kensington, do you think it's acceptable that Ms. Woods is not prepared?
No, I don't.
Would you support my decision to ask her to leave class and to return only when she is prepared?
Absolutely.
So as we saw in that scene, it was logical in Harvard Law School that the professor would hold the student accountable for what was expected on the first day. But what was so emotional and traumatic was that Dr. Stromwell, checked with another student and asked if it was acceptable for her to ask the student to leave because she wasn't prepared. Now, I don't know about you, but that would be traumatizing. It's not just in a graduate class, but especially in an undergraduate class. If all the professors expected you on the first day to have readings done and be prepared to answer questions, and then if you hadn't been prepared and you couldn't answer a question, you were ousted from the classroom. So now I return to the essay's question that it's trying to answer. And it's trying to answer how effective is this Socratic scene in Legally Blonde on its intended audience. And even we're trying to consider what purpose does it have. If it has the purpose of increasing the number of law students going to law school, overall, I think it might be successful. But from this particular scene, it probably functions as a warning to anyone considering going to law school that you are going to be held accountable. So in your essay, you discuss how the initial scene that's logical about the classroom and the professor, people taking the seats, having computers, taking notes, and how Elle Woods kind of functions as someone who's clueless, doesn't know what's going on. This is all credible. You find people who turn up in class, even in graduate school, who really haven't read the instructions and don't know what's going on. So overall, I do think that from a very short and initial analysis of the scene on its effectiveness for a PG-13 to adult chick flick audience, I would say that the scene is pretty effective because it's credible. It's also logical in many ways, and it's very emotional because of Elwood's being in that classroom and everybody in the audience wanting to root for Elle Woods and her success at Harvard Law School. So that was just a very short peek at the kind of analysis I'm expecting you to do on a text that's related to college. This is the type of thinking that I'm expecting you to be able to do in your downdraft, and I expect it to look pretty messy. A successful downdraft ends with the point that you have to make about the effectiveness of the text on its intended audience. And if you do have any problems identifying who that intended audience is, please ask. Bye.